Hello, everyone. My name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the novel Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte. Now, before I go into the summary and analysis of this novel, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and/or comment so that the channel can continue to grow. In this novel, we meet a little girl by the name of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is an orphan. Her parents died when she was at a very young age, and she is sent to live with Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed hates Jane Eyre. Her husband loved Jane Eyre a lot to the point where he loved Jane Eyre more than he loved his own children. So after he dies, Mrs. Reed does everything that she can to treat Jane Eyre poorly. Her three kids also treat Jane Eyre poorly. They don't talk to her. They don't socialize with her. They try not to eat with her. So she spends the first 10 years of her life alone and by herself and being treated like she's a worthless human being. Now, these individuals, Mrs. Reed, she comes from a rich family. She has a lot of wealth. She lives in a very nice, massive house. But still, she feels like she can't live with Jane Eyre. That her, rich kids, her pristine kids, just can't live with such a poor girl, such a unfortunate human being. So Mrs. Reed kicks Jane Eyre out of her house and she sends her to a public charity school by the name of Lowood. She doesn't spend any money to send Jane Eyre to Lowood. She just sends her there because she doesn't want she doesn't want anything to do with her. So Jane Eyre goes to Lowood School, and that's where she basically grows up and gets educated. Life at Lowood is really not good. It's Christianity is a big thing within England at the time that this novel was being written. And at Lowood School, you see a heavy Christian presence there, and Jane Eyre is taught respect and Christianity and doing what you need to do in discipline. The food is not edible there. Most of the food is it's not something you can eat. If somebody takes pity on you when the food is really bad, you could probably get some bread and cheese, but that's pretty much the highlights. That's the highlight of the food at Lowood. So she grows up at Lowood. She does the best that she can to survive there. She meets this girl by the name of Helen, and Helen makes her life livable, bearable. But the thing is, like, eventually Helen dies of consumption, and Jane Eyre is by herself, and the world is still dark for her. Her parents died when she was at a very young age, and now her best friend dies also. So after a while, after living at Lowood for a while, after being educated at Lowood for a while, she gets a job at Thornfield Hall, working for Mr. Rochester. Now, before Jane Eyre even goes to Thornfield Hall, she has to ask Mrs. Reed for permission, and Mrs. Reed basically says, "I don't care what you do. Your life is your life. I just don't care about you." So Jane Eyre is living at Thornfield Hall, and in Thornfield Hall, she is educating this little girl who is and who is not. We really don't know, or it's not really revealed to us who the father of this little girl is. It possibly is Mr. Rochester, but he just basically takes her in just because there's really he doesn't want to take the chance that it is his child, and he abandons her. And he doesn't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So he hires Jane Eyre to educate her. So Jane Eyre educates this child, and life goes on. And what happens is we see Mr. Rochester fall in love with Jane Eyre, and so they fall in love together. They start to get close to each other. And eventually, what happens is, after a while, this book is very long, so we do see different suitors try to marry Mr. Rochester because of his wealth, because of his money, and all of his property. Thornfield Hall is this massive mansion with houses surrounding it, and there's a lot of land. And he has a lot of wealth. So a lot of different types of women from upper class society, try to marry him and try to be with him. But he gets to know, or he starts to understand, that a lot of them just want his money or want access to his money. So life goes on, and eventually what happens is Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, they decide to get married. Now the thing is, the marriage doesn't go through because eventually the Jane Eyre learns that Mr. Rochester is already married. The thing is, in the attic or in the top floor of Thornfield Hall, Mr. Rochester's wife lives there. And the reason why Mr. Rochester doesn't talk about her and the reason why Mr. Rochester wants to get married again is because his wife is basically mad. She wasn't mad to the point where she needed to be locked up when he first met her. But the thing is, like, because of the fact that he was locking her up in the top floor and keeping her away from people. Her mental health decreased, and throughout the novel, we kind of see Bertha Mason escaping and causing havoc without throughout Thornfield Hall. She attacks people. She sets fires. She does different things to make Mr. Rochester upset and to kind of torment Mr. Rochester. She's angry. Bertha Mason is angry, even though she's in a way mad. She still knows that she's married to Mr. Rochester, and when she sees that, or when she gets, or she starts to understand that he's about to get married to Jane Eyre, she does what she can to kind of make her presence known. So the novel goes on. This all gets revealed to Jane Eyre, and Mr. Rochester tries to marry Jane Eyre. It doesn't go through. He wants her to stay with him to somehow carry on with their relationship, but this doesn't really go the way he wants it to. And Jane Eyre, eventually, what she does is she abandons Thornfield Hall and she escapes. Now, this leaves Mr. Rochester in a place where he's unhappy. He's in a state of melancholy. His life is just not what he wants it to be. He can't break off his marriage. It's the novel is created in a time where you can't just get divorced when you want to. In England at this point, divorce was very frowned upon. So if you're married, you're married. Unless your wife or husband dies, you don't really get divorced. And so Jane Eyre leaves Thornfield Hall. She has nowhere to go. She can't go to Mrs. Reed's manor or house, or she can't go back to them. She can't go back to Lowood. She can't go back to Thornfield Hall. She just literally wanders within the country or within the countryside, and she uses all the money she had with her for food and to just survive. And she came to the point where she was literally about to die. But the thing is, like, by chance, by luck, she actually stumbles upon Saint John, this minister that takes her in. And then later it's revealed that Saint John is her cousin. And she meets her other cousins, and they all kind of eventually start to live together. At first, they wanted to throw her out. At first, they wanted nothing to do with her. But when they figure out that they're all family, they live together, they exist together, and Jane Eyre eventually gets a job at a local school that St. John gets her, and St. John, in a way, becomes her benefactor, and he's the one that helps her get a job and helps her get settled, and life starts to get back on track for her. She has a job. She found some cousins of hers, so she has family now. So life looks better. But during one instance, during a part of the novel, she's by herself and she kind of hears Rochester's voice calling out to her. Now the thing is, Jane Eyre loves Rochester, and Mr. Rochester loves her. The thing is, like, she just didn't want to be a mistress. She didn't want to be this woman that is married to someone, or she didn't want to be with someone that's already married. And when she hears Rochester's voice calling out to her, Jane Eyre leaves her home with her cousins, and she goes to Thornfield. And when she gets to Thornfield Hall, she finds it destroyed. It's completely burned. Like, there was a massive fire. What basically happened is Bertha Mason burned it to the ground, and then she jumped off the roof and she killed herself. And so that opened an opportunity for Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester to be together. Like, the novel doesn't outright say it like that, but when you're reading through the novel, you kind of get this idea that, okay, this fire happened, the mansion burned down to the ground, Bertha Mason is dead, so okay, now we can see Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre being together. They find each other. um, Mr. Rochester was living in like one of the surrounding houses near his mansion. And when Jane Eyre finds him, he's crippled. He lost his sight, and things are not going well for him. They kind of like rekindle their relationship, and eventually, what happens is they get married. The really good thing that happens to Jane Eyre is that her uncle, who was looking for her throughout the novel, John Eyre, left her 20,000 pounds, which is a lot of money. And in a wonderful way, in a good manner way, she actually splits it with her cousins. She gives Saint John um, an even portion, and her other cousins an even portion of it. And they kind of live happily ever after. She gets married to Rochester. Her cousins have money; they can do better things with their lives. Saint John actually goes off to India and preaches and tries to convert people. There was a little scene within the novel or portion of the novel where Saint John tries to marry his own cousin. He tried to marry Jane Eyre, but she didn't go with it because, you know, she didn't love him. She didn't want to be with him, and she couldn't see herself suffering by the hands of Saint John, who's this like very serious and religious individual that's unbending. So the novel ends with Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre living together. They're happy. Mr. Rochester was blind for a while, but he does regain his vision. Well, not the whole thing, but partial vision back. And so the novel kind of ends in a place where Mr. Rochester is not completely controlling and not completely the benefactor or the breadwinner of the relationship. It's this place where Jane Eyre has money to herself. She can spend her money how she wants to. She can be her own individual with her own identity, and he still has money of his own. So they love each other and they're married to each other because they want to, not because they have to. And also, there's no power struggle with who has the power of the purse. In terms of analysis, this novel is very significant. You kind of see that Jane Eyre creates her own identity and figure out a way through life that pretty much was not exist in existence for a lot of women at the time. The thing is, during the era when this novel was written, it's either if you're a woman, you pretty much get married, and whatever your husband wants, that's what happens. We're talking about the early 19th century, and in the 19th century, basically, the only way you can get out of poverty as a woman, or the only way you could somewhat get some financial independence, is by marrying a good husband that gives you money, or somewhat treats you in a way where you can have some identity and have some independence. I mean, we see that throughout the novel with the number of women that try to marry Rochester just for his money and for his wealth, because not that many women within the early 19th century could just go out and create business and create income for themselves and be independent. So even though that Jane Eyre inherits her wealth from her uncle, who is a man, she is a woman who becomes rich or becomes wealthy, and she has freedom to use that money however she wishes. So in the end, she does gain independence and gain financial independence that is not controlled by somebody else. Within the novel, we see her being controlled by a lot of people, with the authority at Lowood School, with Mrs. Reed as an authority, with Rochester as an authority, because throughout the novel, Rochester was this overpowering individual that loved her, but at the same time tried to control her. And that's the same thing with her cousins, both sets of cousins, her cousins with Mrs. Reed and her cousins when she meets St. John. St. John tried to control her, and her other cousins tried to push her in the path that they thought that was best for her. But we see throughout the novel where Jane Eyre gets independence and the ability to control her own life and what she wants to do. When she inherits or gains that 20,000 pounds, she decides herself independently to split it with her cousins so that they can have some comforts and be independent by themselves. That was her decision, and her decision to marry Rochester was not because it was not out of need. It was because of the fundamental fact that she loved him and she wanted to be with him. So the novel ends in a very good place, and it also delivers this message of female independence or women being in control of their lives and what they can achieve when they have control of their lives. So it's very significant because in the 19th century, this was not happening. The only way a woman could get out of poverty or create an identity for themselves is by getting married and literally becoming, you know, the partner of a good husband or pretty much being a part of your husband's identity. And there was no way for you to make an identity for yourself. But Jane Eyre does make one for herself in this novel, and she is free in of a way. She is independent, and no one controls her by the end of the novel. So that is my summary and analysis of the novel. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video.